All right, good morning, everyone. Sorry this has taken me so long, but finally I've had a chance to sit down and record a video about our work on conservation. So our last new topic of the Year 12 content. So first of all, we've got to discuss the human threat to biodiversity. So there was a human population explosion. If you have a look in the textbook, there's a graph, and population or human population on Earth remains fairly consistent until sort of between 16 to 1800, and there's a very small rise. And that very small rise is because we learned how to farm plants and animals. And so there was suddenly a reliable supply of food, which meant that the children of families were living for much longer, and they weren't dying sort of as early, and so the population was able to increase. This population increase, however, was on a fairly small and kind of local scale. So if you look at that picture of that graph, you can see a kind of a little incline to the line. However, later on, and I think it's from just after 1800, if I remember correctly, the line shoots up. It's almost, like an exponential diagonal line. And that's because during that time period, we started to develop tools and then machines that enabled us to farm on a much larger scale. So you weren't just sort of, your local little farmer, supplying your particular household or your, town. It was on a huge, huge scale. We've also developed medicines, which obviously keep us alive for longer. We've developed engines that burn fossil fuels, which sort of helps us with transportation and movement of people and resources, as well as, machinery for farming. But the downside of that is obviously we're releasing greenhouse gases. We have started to cut down areas of the rainforest for crop and cattle. So because the demand for food went up, we're having to find more land to grow plants or, rear animals. So obviously destruction of the rainforest, to do that is an issue. And we've also developed floating factories that can clear fish from whole areas of the ocean. So that obviously puts a greater strain on those resources, a greater strain on that population of fish, because it is nowhere near the same as sort of, your local individual man or, group of fishermen going out to feed just the village and, provide them with just what they need. So the human population is over 7 billion and growing, and every individual contributes greenhouse gases. Lots of people try to reduce that, obviously, reducing carbon footprints, etc. But just breathing produces a greenhouse gas. And the consumption of food, we all eat food, obviously, and there are greenhouse gases associated with, growing it, making it, packaging it, distributing it to the supermarket where you buy it. We all produce bodily waste, which has to go somewhere. So, sewage pollution of water is a big issue. And we are taking resources from the biosphere. Crops, plants, wood, minerals, things like that are all being taken. So this is sort of why humans are kind of a threat to biodiversity. The two big ways that we are a threat are through climate change and depletion of biological resources. So I'll talk about climate change first. So there is kind of growing agreement sort of in scientific communities that climate change is happening. There's quite a few people that deny it and don't think it is happening, but science is kind of generally pointing us towards the fact that it is. Sort of the evidence to support this is that temperatures are rising, there's changes in overall climate patterns, and there is an increasing number and frequency of extreme weather events. Extreme weather events are your things like your droughts, your floods, your hurricanes, your tornadoes. So this isn't just it was hot last week but now it's okay. It's climate patterns. When we're talking about weather, we're talking about kind of day to day, what's the weather today. When we're talking about climate, you're talking about it over an extended period of time. So we're seeing changes over those climate patterns. So it's not one-off freak events, it's a consistent change for the worse, really. Now, the world's climate has changed regularly over time. It's something that has happened previously. Sort of fossils and fossil records show that we have gone through ice ages and we have gone through periods where there's been tropical heat and desertification. So, areas being kind of turned into deserts. However, the difference is this time it's happening quickly, and evidence suggests it's a direct result of human activities. Okay, so this is where it's different, and kind of where it's more of an issue, and where we are as humans being more of a threat to that biodiversity. There is a depletion of biological resources. So as we said, the human population explosion, the growing world population means there's an increase in demand for resources, that food, that land, that firewood. And more economically developed areas, people have gone beyond meeting basic needs. So, think of us here in the UAE, places over Europe, America, Australia, etc. People aren't just eating to survive, and they're not just, building a basic simple structure for shelter. Okay, we consume whatever food we want, food that's completely out of season and has had to be, transported in, food that's not grown locally. We're eating food to an excessive amount, beyond what we need to survive. And, with homes, it's not just, as I said, a basic structure to keep a roof over your head, bigger, better, fancier, more air conditioning, more swimming pools, etc. So all of this means that the biological resources are being depleted and ecosystems are being destroyed. Now, the way we can deal with this is through conservation, which is kind of a big buzzword, and you will definitely have some ideas of some conservation methods. So conservation means keeping and protecting a living and changing environment, and there are a few different kind of techniques or things that people can do that comes under conservation efforts, and those include reclaiming land after industrial use, setting up sustainable agricultural systems, so sustainable farming, protection of a single threatened species, and global legislation on pollution levels and greenhouse gas emissions. So that last one is a bit of a controversial one. The most kind of well-known agreement that you guys might be aware of is the Paris Agreement, which America controversially pulled out of, and that was an agreement on CO2 emissions. All right, so those are kind of 4 different ways that you can conserve, you can play a part in conservation. Now, this third one, protection of a single threatened species, is perhaps the one that people think of most when you talk about conservation. And those single threatened species can either be an animal species, or also we do conservation of plants. And there are 2 ways you can do it. It's either ex situ conservation, so that's outside the natural habitats, so think of things like zoos and seed banks, or you can do in situ conservation, which is where it takes place in its natural habitat. So this might be something like a national reserve or something. They have a few of them in Africa, to keep the animals in their actual environment, but to protect them within that environment. So that would kind of be an example of an in situ. Now we're going to look in more detail at ex situ, which is zoos for animals and seed banks for plants. So we'll start off with plants. So around about 25% of the world's flowering plant species could disappear within the next 50 years. That's kind of the estimate. If things carry on as they are, we're going to lose around about 25% of the world's flowering plant species, which is quite a lot. Botanical gardens maintain collections of many of the most interesting and unusual plants. So we kind of rely on botanical gardens like zoos for plants to kind of keep some examples of the more kind of weird and wonderful specimens. A step up from that is a seed bank. There's one called the Millennium Seed Bank, which is in Kew, which is in London, UK. And the first aim of this Millennium Seed Bank, which shockingly was established at the millennium, was to collect and conserve seeds of the entire UK native flora. So they wanted seeds of every single flower that was native to the United Kingdom, and they achieved that aim in 2009. And then their second aim was to conserve the seeds of an additional 25% of the flowers of the whole world by 2020. So as I said in our lesson, I haven't checked if they're still working on it. They're not at the end of 2020, and obviously with everything that's going on in the world right now, that might be delayed slightly. But they kind of completed their UK and native aim, and now they're working on 25% of the rest of the world. And there are seed banks elsewhere. This isn't the only one. The UAE obviously didn't want to be outdone, so it's opened its own one in Abu Dhabi, and they are collecting and documenting plants with a focus from the UAE. There's also one, I think it's in Sri Lanka, it mentions in the book. Now, how seed banks work is you preserve many plants in a state of suspended animation. So it is a bank for seeds. You are collecting them, you are keeping them for future use if needs be. So the actual process involved is you take live seeds, and obviously you collect them from the wild, and you remove them from any fruits and you clean them, and then you screen them using an X-ray to check they have fully developed embryos. If they don't, there's no point storing them, you can't do anything with them. All right, so those seeds that don't have those developed embryos could be discarded. They're then dried and put into jars, and they're stored between minus 20 degrees and minus 40 degrees. And actually, the cooler the better, it would seem. So then obviously you can use those seeds that you've got stored, you can thaw them out, warm them up, and then you can obviously use them to grow a fully formed plant at a later date. Now, there are some positives and negatives to seed banks. The positives are that many seeds actually do survive this process and remain capable of germinating for up to 200 years. So if you imagine, seed we collect today could still be used to create a plant in 200 years' time. So if that plant is kind of lost from the wild, then you still have a source of it and you can kind of reintroduce it. Most plants make a large number of seeds. They can be collected without damaging the natural population. So it's not like you're going in and kind of taking away and reducing the population, the wild population. There's loads of seeds available. Seeds are usually small, so it's kind of cheap and easy to store large numbers of them. If you imagine, storing 100,000 seeds is obviously going to take up less room than storing 100,000 plants. Seeds contain all the genetic material of the plant, so are a record of the genetic makeup of the species. And around about 80% of known species of plant can be stored in this way. So it is an effective method. It is, it does work, and it works for a lot of seeds. But the negative is obviously if it works for 80%, there's 20% that it doesn't work from. And the seeds of those species don't store well in this kind of way. It's not appropriate. Some examples, unfortunately, are some of kind of the big, food resources and kind of material resources. So mango, avocado, cacao and coconut in terms of like a food producing, a crop, producing plant. And then rubber and oak in terms of alternative resources. Seeds of these plants don't really work, don't store particularly well in seed banks. So that means we have to conserve them differently. So an example would be growing them in like a plantation or an orchard. So this would be your in situ example of conservation. So kind of growing a large number of them in a protected area so that you've got a constant source of the flower or the plant in the wild. But obviously these takes up a lot of room. You have to kind of have the land space for them. When we're talking orchards and plantations, we're talking about acres of land. It's not like your back garden. And obviously it takes a lot of work to kind of maintain them. All right, we're going to look at animal conservation, but I'm going to do that in the next video because I'm running short of time. So please join me for part 2.